I haven't seen the Elite keynote, but I have seen a lot of benchmarks, a lot of speculation, and a really good Snazzy Labs video. Apple Silicon Magic is over, which slaughtered, as you can see by the plays. And as it should. It was a really good video, really leveled take on it. I'm going to go a step further, though, because I don't fully agree with him. And I think the reasons are more traditional economics. We have to think a lot about Apple's economic incentives here. So this box is what Apple does. So in this box are all of the things that Apple does to make a product. So in here, we have a lot of pieces. We have the processor. We'll say CPU. We'll just say hardware. Give it a more generic term. But you know what I mean here. What I'm specifically thinking of when I say this is things like a phone or a computer. You also have the services, which they own. There's a lot of pieces in here. Even the architecture. Although the architecture is a bit of a fighting point because the architecture is so directly tied to something that they don't own, which is ARM. That said, Apple owns the CPU, the hardware the CPU goes into, the services that you will use as a user of the device, and the architecture of the CPU itself. Apple owns all of these things, and also they own the software, which is another really big deal here. Apple owns all of these things. And there is an important chain that you have to follow here too. If the architecture changes, that affects the CPU. If that changes, it also affects the software. If the software changes, that affects the services that you can use. So the relationship between ARM and Apple is really important because when an ARM and an architecture change occurs, everything downstream gets changed as well. This is only viable because Apple owns all of these pieces. So let's talk about this in the context of Snapdragon. I'll call this the Snapdragon problem. So first, we had to get rid of this big box as it no longer exists. Now we're going to move all of these things appropriately far away from each other. Honestly, the services and software, we can just get rid of that because all of these are different boxes now. The architecture, this guy's owned by Snapdragon, well, Qualcomm, where they designed the architecture and kind of designed the CPU as well. So we can throw this in here as well. Where things start to get messy is the fact that the hardware that uses the CPU is owned by somebody entirely unrelated. The hardware is going to be owned by whatever manufacturer. So this could be Samsung, Google, LG. Wait, LG doesn't make phones anymore. Most of the manufacturers are dead now, aren't they? I guess it's like 15 Chinese brands and like Samsung now. But you get the idea. We'll just call this non-Apple phones. So the hardware that you're purchasing is by companies that aren't Apple, but more importantly, it's companies that aren't Qualcomm. And the software is also made by another company, in this case, Microsoft or Google. Hopefully you can see the problem here. This makes sweeping changes really tough. Previously, we didn't have ARM, we had x86, 64, through Intel and AMD. Now that it's ARM, changes have to propagate through this whole chain in order for Windows to function. Technically speaking, Windows has an ARM mode, but there is very little incentive for Microsoft to change things all the way out here. They just don't care or have the right involvement to make the types of changes that would be necessary here. It's unrealistic to think that this diagram, where Apple owns the entire orchestration of how these changes occur, would ever fall behind the utter fucking chaos that is the more modular world outside of Apple. And I'm saying as a person who loves to build their own computers, that's nerdy about all of the hardware and software about all of these things, it's just borderline delusional to think that somehow the quality level that we're expecting and that we get from Apple's devices can occur when a change like this happens, going from x86 to ARM. That now has to be propagated through the architecture and the new CPU hardware that is released. And then that has to make it all the way to the software layer so that we can actually take advantage of the performance wins inside of your operating system. And being that Windows has not changed architectures ever, and I mean that, ever. Windows has been based on x86 forever. You can't just swap that. You can pretend you can just swap that, but you can't. And we're going to watch that continue to happen because Windows RT is a joke. That might change. It would honestly be really cool if that changed. But in order for that to change, you need really good x86 emulation, which Apple had through Rosetta. I don't even know where I would put Rosetta. It would probably be between the software and the architecture. Actually, no, that would technically go in the CPU. Would I put Rosetta as part of the architecture or part of the CPU? Regardless, there is a layer that Apple made because, again, they own this whole box and they recognized that this particular arrow was going to be really difficult. So they built something on this row. They built Rosetta to make the translation layer for the old and new software significantly better. You can only do that if you own everything. And this is the problem that Snapdragon is going to run into, is they own fucking nothing. Qualcomm sits in this box alone. They have nothing to do with the ARM design. They have nothing to do with the software or even the hardware the devices ship on. They live in this box. The other important thing to note is that Qualcomm has no competition. There is no alternative to Qualcomm that is actually reasonable to purchase. So much so that Apple had a long-running issue where they were trying to avoid Qualcomm because Qualcomm's fees are egregious. God, this is going to be a whole separate tangent. This is a mess. So you already know this about Qualcomm. They charge you a percentage of the phone's cost, not just a chip price. So even if the chip costs them 5 cents, if your phone costs $1,000, they want 5%, and they want that percent no matter what. If your phone costs $100 or $1,000, they still charge the same percentage, which Apple thought was highway robbery, which is why Apple decided to instead sign a contract with Intel to make modems instead. Because Apple didn't need the Snapdragon processor, where yes, if the processor on your phone is from Qualcomm and the modem and all these other things are, maybe a percentage fee is a little more reasonable, but when it's not, instead you're just paying that same huge fee just for the cell phone modem, not for the CPU itself. It gets a little absurd. So they went with Intel instead, and Intel's modems sucked. iPhones had service issues for a long time, and I know that as an iPhone user. It was obnoxious. Eventually they gave up, and Intel's modem division collapsed. And then Apple bought the modem division from Intel. Ugh, it's such a long, chaotic history. But again, like when there is no competition, there is no innovation. And since there is no real competition for Qualcomm because Apple doesn't sell their chips to other places, we're all stuck with whatever Qualcomm puts out. They've had no reason to improve their processors because there's nobody competing. Except recently, Google is kind of doing CPUs for their phones. It's a whole thing. The point is that when you only have one option, things don't improve. And this was the problem with Intel too, where Apple was stuck on Intel processors for so long because there was no better options. So they ended up making their own option, doing this crazy process to move over to it, and just destroying a huge portion of Intel's market in said process. But you have to think about the incentives for the market here. Why would Qualcomm improve? What benefit does Qualcomm get out of making a significantly better processor? For phones, nothing. They already won phones. Apple will never use Qualcomm again, and every other manufacturer has to use Qualcomm because of the state of the market. So the only reason Qualcomm would have any incentive to innovate is to get their processors in computers. But this is even crazier with computers because computers sell less than phones now. So the likelihood that they can make meaningful amounts of money off of that are pretty close to zero. And here's where we're stuck. In a world where there is no competition for processors, there is no incentive for companies to actually improve on these processors, much less build software that supports them. And the distance between all of these people who are affected results in nothing really happening. Android phones have flatlined in performance for the last 5 or 6 years. And iPhones still get twice as fast every year or two. So it's just different worlds, absolute different worlds. And it's incredibly frustrating to think that people see a really fast benchmark and assume Apple is doomed. Because Apple's win isn't their performance. Apple's win is their integration layer, allowing them to make actual important changes that no other company in the world is able to do. And also has no real incentive to do such. It's the same reason Android phones stop being good after 6 months, because the phone company doesn't make any money once you bought the phone. It's just basic market incentives, and I feel like people miss this a lot. I actually recorded a video a while back that I need to either edit or re-record, the hidden cost of Android. And this video is basically about that idea, that an Android company selling you a phone stops making money the moment you buy the phone, because you're not going to subscribe to Samsung Cloud. You're not going to subscribe to LG's photo parsing, whatever. You're not going to subscribe to anything that these companies make. And you're probably not going to buy their headphones or their accessories either. So Samsung and LG and Oppo and Redmi and all these companies make $0 after you purchase the phone. In fact, you can only cost them money. Whereas Apple makes a shitload of money on other accessories, on their ecosystem stuff, on all of the chaos that they've done with the iCloud stuff, on AirPods alone. AirPods make more money a year than the iPod did by a lot. It just makes obvious sense, and people don't seem to understand the basic market incentives of why an Android phone will have worse support than an iPhone. So yeah, I don't think other companies can compete due to the nature of how these markets are split up, but I could be wrong. I would love to have a Windows computer that's as fast as my Mac computers, but as somebody who uses a lot of both for my content, I'm sticking with my MacBook for a while. Hope that was a good tangent. Thank you, Noax, for nerd sniping me.